turn this over. Okay.
Well, good afternoon. I appreciate folks coming out today. For those that I don't know, my name's Eric Norberg. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at UT Martin. This event is part of a series that we have called the UT Martin Research Series. For those that may not have been in this space before, a little bit of housekeeping. If you were to go back this way toward the nice paintings at the far wall, we have restrooms and a drinking fountain there if you should need them. We do have refreshments. Feel free to get up and help yourself to some refreshments. I also want to thank the speaker and his lovely spouse for bringing some additional food on top of the cookies and the yellow liquid from Sedesco, which no one quite knows what's in there. I want to thank our library faculty and staff who provide various support to this series as we work on it. This was developed as an opportunity for us to showcase research that's done by faculty across the campus. A lot of people think about UT Martin as a teaching college, and we do a lot of really great teaching, including our speaker today. But all of our faculty are required to participate in service activities and in scholarship. And today's speaker is a good example of the scholarship that's happening. It's been a fun series for us to do. We're in our 5th year now. We've had scientists, we've had social scientists, we've had musicians, we've had artists, and I think it's interesting to see how each of the faculty members on our campus in the disciplines that they serve do very different types of research, and the outputs from those are very different as well. We have 2 more events in the series this semester. Just want to make sure that you're aware of those. On Tuesday, March the 10th, in this space, we will have Dr. Abigail Shelton from the chemistry department. The title of her presentation is Heavy Metal Honeys. I'll leave you to look at that yourself. And then on April the 2nd, Thursday at 4 o'clock, we'll have John Cole from the Ag Department, who's going to talk about his research journey as a faculty member who's come out of private sector engineering work. So please plan to attend those as you can go. Today's speaker course, Dr. Charles Hammond, is in the Department of English and Modern Foreign Languages. I see that his chair is here to support him. Thank you. And he's been doing work on Austrian-born German language literary authors. We're going to hear about Franz Kafka today, but he's also done work on Hugo von Hofmannsthal. I'm going to try it here. And thankfully, he wanted me to also, I'm also including the variety of journals that he's published in. Very easy for me to note the Pacific Coast Philology. Thank you for that one. But also Colloquia Germanica, Orbis Literarum, and German Romanische Monteschrift. Okay, I might be a German guy sometime. Chuck, as we know him, is currently working on a book about Kafka's short story, In the Penal Colony. I can talk a little bit about that today. Our faculty and staff know Chuck very well because he's one of our more challenging interlibrary loan requesters. Because he's interested in things that were published in a foreign language, which can be challenging not only to find here in the United States, but can be challenging to get a hold of in other locations. But we're always up for a challenge. Of course, in addition to his teaching and writing, Chuck's involved in a variety of things. One of the most interesting, and for those of you who may take a German class while you are a student, he leads a regular travel abroad study tour to Braunschweig, Germany. And I'm sure he'd be glad to talk to you about how to get involved in that travel. A very interesting place to go. That opportunity is available to any student who's taking German classes on campus here. I'm sure he's also happy to welcome non-German classes, but it gets a little harder when you get to Germany if you don't have a bit of the language. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Charles Hammond.
Testing. Yes? Okay, good. All right. Welcome, everybody. I am very encouraged by your presence. Thank you so much. I wanted to also extend my thanks to the Library Lecture Series, to Herr Professor Dr. Norberg himself, to Emeriti. I'd like to recognize my former boss, Frau Professor Dr. Lynn Alexander, and Herr Professor Doctor, one of my best students, Sheldon Clayton. I'm really happy they're here because if I were retired, I'm not sure I'd be here. Okay, to be honest with you. Thank you also for not Bad Bunny boycotting me, for the crime of speaking a foreign language. Just all good vibes all around. Okay, good. So our topic is sex, gender, and procreation in Kafka. But first, who knows pretty much nothing about Kafka? Raise your hand. It's not a crime, I promise. Okay, good. All right. So we're going to learn just a little bit about his life. So we're going to do that for about 20 minutes. And then I'm going to read you a couple excerpts from an article I wrote on this topic for about 15, 20 minutes max. And then I'm thinking 10 to 20 minutes of discussion. Yes? And then you can have a civilized evening meal. Okay, after that. So good. All right. So let me see if I can use this effectively. Okay. I'd like this to be a little bit interactive, if that's okay. So if it's okay, I'd like people to read it for me. I'm known as a shy person with very few opinions of his own. And so it's very hard for me to stand in front of a group. And so I'm going to start with my student Cam. Please read out loud, please.
Franz Kafka was born in 1883 as the only son of Hermann and Julia Kafka. He had four younger sisters.
Correct. Okay, so 5 children altogether. There were 2 other sons that were born, but they died during childhood. Okay. All 4 of his sisters died in the Holocaust, in concentration camps. Okay. But that was much later. Okay. Okay. Olivia.
Kafka's father was from a poor family from a rural village in the east. Like many Jews in the mid-19th century, he had moved to the big city, Prague. There he opened a very successful business and married a Jewish woman from a well-to-do family.
Right. So how many people would describe themselves as middle class? Like coming from middle class family, most of us, right? And the middle class family, we don't think about it as an ideology. And part of that ideology, probably the centerpiece, I'd say, of the middle class ideology is the notion of progress, right? My children are going to have opportunities that what? That I didn't have, right? And Kafka's father was the epitome of that. He was really from a poor family. And really, there's no such thing as raising yourself up by your bootstraps, but if there were, he would be the epitome of it. He started a business selling like fine accessories, and it grew quickly, and it was successful. And once he reached a certain level of success, he could actually ask for this wealthy young woman's hand in marriage. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. Next. Could you read that for me? Oh, is that bad? Go for it.
Kafka,
Mm-hmm.
is this in the microphone?
Yeah.
Uh,
Describe.
Kafka described his own childhood as lonely and sad, since he was the only surviving son and spent most of his time at home with women in his father's employ. Wet nurses, cooks, governesses, tutors, etc., because his parents were constantly dealing with the family business.
Right. Okay. So wet nurses, cooks, governesses, tutors, etc. Right. And so all of these figures, pretty much all of them female, were, in a sense, family, but all of them were what? They were all employees, right? They were all being paid, right? Good. Could you pass that on, please? Or yeah. Okay.
He was an excellent student, but always felt like he was on the verge of failing. He went on to study law and after graduation found a position as an attorney at an accident insurance agency. He was an excellent lawyer, but he hated his job all the same.
Right. He was a fantastic lawyer. He was the only Jew in a accident insurance agency
Excuse me, Chuck. Chris just put another microphone down on the chair in front of you. I just want to remind you that we do have people looking in on the live stream. So if somebody's not talking on a microphone, they're not going to hear it either in the live stream or in the recording. My apologies.
Good. All right. So, so he was an excellent lawyer. His job was actually very modern. The insurance industry was it was sort of a new industry at the time. And his job basically was, if you were working in a factory and let's say you lost a finger or two, which wasn't uncommon at the time, it was his job to figure out how much money that was worth and how much compensation you received for that, which is he himself found a bit odd, right? Okay, good. Okay, and then, okay, Kafka described his own childhood as, oh, did I do this? I'm so sorry. Let's keep going. All right. In his letters and his diaries, he often refers to his fictional writing as his real work. And he had a really weird schedule because he wanted to be a writer. He was a lawyer, right? Those are long hours, right? So he'd go to work, he'd come home, he'd take a nap, then he'd get up at like 9 p.m. and then write until sometimes 4 or 5 a.m., whatever, and then he'd have to get ready for work. Okay, and that took a real toll on his body. Kafka's father, Hammond, for his part, had little understanding for his son's lifelong passion for writing. Similarly, his mother considered her son's passion for literature, quote, just a passing phase. That's also very middle class, isn't it? The middle class likes art, but it likes art as something that you can consume, right? You can go, before Christmas, you and the family can go see, the Nutcracker or something like that. But you probably wouldn't, as a middle class father or middle class parent, be that crazy about one of your kids saying, hey, I want to play in the orchestra one day, right? Because what's very important to the middle class, right? The green stuff, okay? This picture depicts something that actually happened. Kafka tried to introduce his father to his writing. His father was very gruff, right? He was all business. Big, strong guy. And he even dedicated it to his father. And his father said, just put it on my bedside table, right? And Kafka felt just crushed by that. Okay. Kafka was a very modern figure. When we say modern in literature, what we mean first and foremost is that his life was fragmented. The pieces did not connect. His outer life often bore little resemblance to his inner life. And if you've ever felt this way, then you have a lot in common with Kafka. Okay? What do I mean by fragmented? Well, we're about to see. For example, he was born and he raised and lived most of his life in the Czech capital, Prague. This was during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right, which ceased to exist after World War I. But at the time, it was this huge empire that encompassed all kinds of peoples, Czechs and Croatians and, Germans and Austrians, everything. So, but he was a member of the Jewish minority, and while he did have a good command of Czech, it was his second language to him. So he was, and was not, Czech. You know where I'm going with this. Okay. So was Kafka Jewish? Well, he came from a Jewish family, but for most of his life he didn't feel very Jewish. In a 100-page letter to his father, the fact that he wrote a 100-page letter to his father should kind of indicate to you that he had some issues, some daddy issues. He didn't even give it to his father. He gave it to his mother. His mother read it and said, I'm not giving your father that, and gave it back to him. So in this 100-page letter to his father, where he reproaches his father for, quote, that little scrap of Judaism you left me. And the picture, it depicts when Kafka would go to synagogue with his father, and they'd go 4 times a year, right, during the biggest Jewish holidays. His father was not particularly devout. So why do you think he went to synagogue? Right, exactly, to be seen at synagogue. right? It shows that he's an upstanding member of what? The Jewish, the community, exactly, the Jewish community. You may have seen or experienced something like that in your life. Okay, my dad was pretty middle class, right? He was a dentist, and he was not particularly devout. And we went to church twice a year, which you can guess. Christmas and you got it. Christmas and Easter, and then it gets even more middle class. After after that, this is in San Diego. After that, we'd all go to brunch next to the ocean. Okay, so this is pretty very middle class. All right, good. So Kafka was bored as hell, bored as heck when he was at the synagogue. He goes into great detail. Okay, so we've established he was and wasn't Czech. He was and wasn't Jewish. So was he German? Not exactly. To say that Kafka spoke and wrote German as his first language is not the same thing as saying he was German. After all, he was a Jew living in a majority Czech population, and unsurprisingly, the ethnic Germans often wanted little to do with the Jews, even if they shared the same language, right? And this is one of the publications at that time, and it said, the headline says that the Jews are becoming more and more of a threat. And it says, protect, and I do mean protect yourselves protect yourselves from the Jewish rule, basically. The Jews made up about 10% of the population. They were German speaking, and they were very, very educated on the average, and that elicited a lot of hatred and resentment, I'd say, and not just in Prague. Okay. So far, we know that Kafka was and was not a lawyer. He was and was not a writer. Was and was not Czech. Was and was not a Jew. Was and was not a German. So it should come as no surprise that Kafka had a recurring nightmare, and I'd say almost fantasy, of being sectioned off into parts. And the dream takes all kinds of different manifestations, but this is the most commonly cited one. It's this image of a butcher's knife just cutting him into pieces, right? His grandfather was a butcher. His father's father. That's one of the reasons his father was just so gruff and stuff. You know, he had a really rough upbringing, actually. And he'd always remind Kafka that he had it so easy. You know. Other aspects of his life compounded his sense of unbelonging. For example, while the times had changed, a lot of middle-class expectations, like the assumption that everybody should get married and have children, persisted. He read and quoted and wrote down in his diary from the Talmud, the Jewish holy book. And one of the lines from the Jewish holy book says, "A man without a wife is not a man." Okay. So he was a lifelong bachelor, right? So this conflicted with his Jewish identity, made him feel inadequate, right? Okay. So, though he was engaged 3 times, Kafka remained a bachelor for his entire life and felt guilty for it. Like many men of his age and class, he also solicited prostitutes, which in turn would make him feel even more guilty for having sexual urges, for paying for sex with working class women. So when it was over, he'd feel sorry for them, because they had to do this in order to earn money, et cetera, and then he'd feel, even more guilty for having done that. He'd feel dirty, and of course, you were really rolling the dice, right, at the turn of the century if you went to a bordello, right? Because at the turn of the century, what was running rampant, Dr. Clayton? Syphilis, yes. In fact, we're pretty sure by now that Nietzsche, for example, died of syphilis, which would explain why in Nietzsche was a contemporary of Kafka's in a sense. He spent the last 10 years of his life completely insane. There. Didn't stop him from writing, but completely insane. Okay. All right. So finally, the feeling of fragmentation was only intensified by the fact that the world in which Kafka's generation was raised was fundamentally different on every level from that of his father's generation. For example, technology had rapidly transformed the world, and with it, the world of possibility, right? So, right, flight, completely new, right? 1903, right? The telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, right? The car, right? Benz, right? The tram, right? These are things that his father's generation couldn't have dreamed of. Okay? And we have all those things now. We just have more modern versions of it. But if you think about it, Kafka's father's generation didn't have any of that stuff. So it's hard for us to express and to comprehend in our 2026 life what a whirlwind change had taken place in the space of one generation, really, in Europe. And it was very, very hard for Kafka, not just Kafka, but his whole generation of young men to speak with their fathers. It was just a completely different understanding of the world. Sociopolitically, women were demanding their rights, right? Workers were developing a class consciousness and a realization of their collective strength. They too demanded their rights, right? And many Zionist Jews were advocating for a Jewish homeland, right? So the State of Israel was founded in 1948, right? But the idea, the groundwork for the State of Israel was laid by a man, an Austrian, named Theodor Herzl. And what is the national language of Israel? Hebrew, that's correct. Okay. Herzl, his conception of the State of Israel would have as its native language German, because most of them spoke German. No. And then you probably have heard of Das Kommunistische Manifest, right? Communist Manifesto, super modern work. Why was it super modern? It was printed in 8 different languages simultaneously. So Marx and Engels were serious about about spreading the word, and they were very successful, okay, for better or for worse. Okay. And then this one says, das Frauenwahlrecht fordern alle Frauen und Mädchen, alle Mütter, alle Arbeiterinnen, right? So all the women, all the girls, all the mothers, all the female workers demand the right to vote. That's what that's saying. Okay. And so these pamphlets and booklets and things like that were the turn of the century equivalent of the internet. Okay. How people spent their free time was evolving too, thanks to new technology. Kafka, for example, loved going to the movies. His first published article was a review of an air show that he'd attended in Italy with his best friend Max Brod, right? So that's an example of a famous German movie, Metropolis, by Fritz Lang. By the way, Metropolis, how many hours was the original Metropolis? You don't know, 9 hours. Yeah. Silent movie. These people had an attention span. Okay, had an attention, 9 hours, right? And there'd be somebody live in the theater playing the piano. Okay. There's Kafka's first article, right? Die Aeroplane in Brescia, right? The airplanes in Brescia. And really, really interesting. It's a journalistic article, but in that journalistic article, he compares the pilot at the controls of the plane to a writer at his desk. It's really, really cool, actually. Spiritually, people were free to explore other religions, right? New Age religions and cults, as well as atheism, meaning having no religion at all, gained adherents, and mysticism and hypnosis, all that kind of stuff gained popularity as well. People looked for alternatives to the religion in which they were raised, right? I mentioned Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche's father was a priest, right? So, Karl Marx came from a Jewish family, right? Sigmund Freud, right, came from a Jewish family. He was an atheist. Okay, He wrote a book. In fact, you're going to see it here in a moment. So this is a really cool show. Yes, oh, Penny Dreadful, isn't it awesome? Yeah, and in Penny Dreadful, they show what a séance might have been like. It was really cool, especially if you had some money, to go to a séance, and they'd bring some like woman who's supposed to be a gypsy, or and she'd come, and everybody would touch the table, and they'd get in contact with the dead, and all kinds of stuff, right? So you have this move towards science, and you've got this simultaneous move away from science. Yeah, there's a spiritualism, right? This was a philosophy of which Kafka himself was an adherent for a while, theosophy by Rudolf Steiner. And then, of course, that's another great series is Freud. You kind of see that. It's so good. Freud season 1. And so playing with hypnosis, right? And then Freud's book, Die Zukunft einer Illusion, the future of an illusion, about religion and what religion represented. He wasn't a big fan. Okay. And much like people today, Kafka followed diet and health fads. So Kafka was really into the Muller method, for example. So he would get up in front of the window, open the window, no matter what the temperature was, often completely naked, and do these exercises in front of the window. He did that for years. That was like a thing. And as the kids say. Or this is actually an extremely funny thing. He was also into Fletcherism. And Fletcher was this guy at the turn of the century who thought that a lot of human ailments could be cured through chewing. So he prescribed that whenever you eat something, you should chew it at least 30 times. And so Kafka would put it in his mouth and go, like this, and drive his father insane. Okay, and he was a vegetarian on top of it, right? Also very modern. Right? Okay. So keep these aspects of Kafka's biography in mind as you listen to this paper on Kafka's first short story entitled The Judgment, and it'll make sense to you. These illustrations here were done by Robert Crumb, and I didn't bring the book, but it's an amazing book called Kafka, where he basically details Kafka's life and summarizes Kafka's chief works. And I consider him the best living illustrator in the United States. And he gave me permission to use his images in one of my articles, and I will always be grateful to him for it. I think he's about 85 now. Okay. He's insane. He's crazy. Okay. So now, don't worry. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. Okay. It's only some sections, and then afterward, hopefully, we can have a discussion. Is everybody still okay? No one slumped over yet? Okay, good. Well, that's always a good sign. Okay. All right. And this will give you an idea of what I write about, also how I write. I think it's very, very important that we academics, to the greatest extent possible, should write in a way that people outside the discipline can easily understand. I think that's extremely important. So I strive to do that. I'm not claiming I do that successfully, but I strive to do that. It also gives you an idea of what your professors do when they go off to these conferences. Okay. Yeah. And also, I guess you'll get an idea of my style. We'll see. All right, here goes. On the night of September 22nd, 1912, in the space of a single sitting, Franz Kafka wrote Das Urteil, The Judgment, a short story that would mark his birth as a writer of the first order. The remarks which an exhausted but clearly exhilarated Kafka entered into his diary upon completion of the tale show the importance that he himself attached to the event. Quote, "That's the only way to write, only with such coherence, only with such a complete outpouring of body and soul." The notion of a story deriving from the opening or outpouring of one's soul is hardly unusual. The idea of a story deriving from the opening up of one's body, however, is much less common. Only on rare occasion does one find a comparable statement by another author about his or her work. Then again, Kafka is not just any author. By asserting his body, as the origin of this groundbreaking work, he alludes, of course, to the many levels on which he gave birth to the story. At the same time, as I wish to show in this paper, the statement serves as a testament to the manner in which the story has given birth to him. In addition, I suggest that it is the father figure in the story that gives real birth to Kafka the writer, a birth that can only occur in and through the fictional death of the story's protagonist, the main character, Georg Bendemann. So I talk about how it's a really autobiographical story. I also discuss how Kafka had a very ambivalent view of fatherhood. What does ambivalent mean, right? He had two opposing views. On the one hand, he considered fatherhood the highest thing that you could possibly achieve. And on the other hand, he was afraid of fatherhood because he felt that fatherhood would mean that he wouldn't be able to write anymore. He barely had any time to write as it was. Okay. All right. How could Kafka be so certain that he would never have children of his own? He said that his whole life. The answer is quite simple. Writing for Kafka took precedence over all other concerns, over family, over career, even over his own health. As he attempted to explain to Felice, writing constituted to his mind the primary reason, the primary justification, really, for existence. To get married and to have children alongside his work as a civil servant would leave no time, to say nothing of energy, for his literary pursuits. Predictably, his first engagement to a young woman named Felice, she was from a Jewish family in Berlin, was unsuccessful. Kafka's inability to reconcile the demands of writing with, quote, the inevitable demands of sexuality, marriage, and family, end quote, therefore were very much on his mind at the time that he wrote The Judgment. Kafka was aware that he would never have children if he wanted to continue pursuing his lifelong passion. The two possibilities excluded one another entirely. But is not writing the exercise of a kind of paternity? A paternity of an altogether different type, perhaps, but a paternity nonetheless. This is precisely the idea which Kafka expressed to his closest friend Max Brod on several occasions. In his biography of Kafka, Brod recalls the way in which Kafka regarded his stories as a kind of substitute for the offspring he would never have. Quote, stories, after all, were his children. In his writing, he was accomplishing, on a remote territory, but independently, something that was analogous to and could stand alongside his father's creative power. Kafka expressed his view of his literary paternity elsewhere as well. In an early letter to Felice, his fiancée, Kafka attempts to console his fiancée for the fact that his writing would always take precedence over his relationship to her. Quote, this is in a letter to her, and he wrote hundreds. I am my novel. I am my stories. Where would I be, I ask you? Where would there be, I ask you, the slightest room for jealousy? In any case, when everything goes well, all my characters come running arm in arm toward you, ultimately to serve you alone. Here, too, Kafka anthropomorphizes the figures in his stories, with Felice assuming the role of primary inspiration, if not a mother figure in her own right. This was particularly true of The Judgment, a tale which Kafka would repeatedly call Deine Geschichte, your story, in his correspondence with Felice. Through The Judgment, Kafka sought to make clear that the path to marriage leads ineluctably to the father, and precisely for that reason, no marriage could ever take place. For in his view, to wed and to have children would be to usurp the mantle of the father, a father whom he both despised and admired, whose strength and vitality far surpassed his own, for himself. By establishing his own family, Kafka would, in essence, be claiming equal status with Hermann Kafka. Quote, and this is from that 100-page letter, I would be on par with you. Which is to say, literally, I would be born on the same level as you. The German word is ebenbürtig. And while for Kafka such a state of parity could never take place in reality, it could take the place in the realm of fantasy, much the way stories, for him, could take the place of real children. Okay, skip. All right. The fragmentary nature of Kafka's literary production. Kafka was unable to finish a story until he was about 30 years old. And it was right after he met this young woman and basically knew he was going to propose to her. And this is what happened, right? Okay. The inability to bring any of his work to completion was a source of continuing frustration for Kafka, as he made known to Felice, his fiancée. Quote, this is in his first letter to her. Now it is one of my woes that I cannot write down in a single flow anything that I have put in order beforehand. In the judgment, however, Kafka succeeds in transcending this limitation for the first time by exposing the internal struggle that he had until now sought to conceal. Set among the stories that preceded and followed it, the tale stands as a literary acknowledgement of what Kafka would later make plain in his letter to his father, where he confesses simply, quote, "My writing was about you." Sorry. What does that song say? We're human after all? I think that was the Human League. All right. Okay. Whereas Kafka had previously subordinated his work to his life by fleeing the source of his real-life suffering, his father, he now subordinated his life to his work by confronting the source of his real-life suffering, his father. That is, the judgment thematizes the paternal-filial father-son conflict rather than sublimating it, as Kafka had thus far done. Through the conscious renunciation of the life of a husband and parent, Kafka enables his metaphysical rebirth as a writer. Such an act of supreme self-sacrifice, however, could only occur at and upon the altar of the Father, the ultimate arbiter of life and death. Little wonder, then, that Kafka's reading of the story before an audience, he read this story in front of an audience, it was accompanied by such a rare outpouring of emotion. Quote, "Towards the end, my hand was moving uncontrollably around and in front of my face," he recalls. "There were tears in my eyes. The indubitability of the story was confirmed. Suddenly, the man who had always played the role of, quote, self-controlled observer was visibly moved by the sheer force of his own words. Here, at last, the fundamental struggle that determined the course of his life laid bare, albeit in fictional form, for all to see. Its substance stood above all doubt, for he had personally borne its leaden weight every day of his adult life." In the section that follows, I examine this fictional confrontation between father and son in order to show how the death of the tale's protagonist enables the birth of its author. First, however, a brief summary is in order. The judgment tells the story of Georg Bendemann, a young businessman who lives with his father. When Georg appears for the first time, he has just completed a letter to his bachelor friend who had immigrated some years ago to St. Petersburg, Russia, in order to start a business of his own. While the friend's entrepreneurial efforts had initially met with some success, his business had since become unprofitable. Nonetheless, the friend has decided to remain in Russia, his visits to his land of birth becoming ever more seldom. Georg's business, however, Georg is the German version of George. Georg's business, meanwhile, has blossomed. Not only that, he has become engaged to a young woman from a well-to-do family. By all appearances, Georg is the picture of middle-class success. Yet somehow he cannot bring himself to inform his expatriate friend about these life-changing events, preferring instead only to discuss, quote, meaningless occurrences in their correspondence. The fiancée, meanwhile, has become increasingly irritated by Georg's reluctance to tell the friend about the imminent marriage. Ultimately, she persuades Georg that he ought to tell his friend about the engagement. Once Georg has written the letter, he approaches his father with the news that he is about to send it off. Initially, the father's reaction is almost indifferent. After taking great pains to assure his son that the answer is of no consequence whatsoever, the father asks Georg whether he really has a friend in St. Petersburg. After some initial hesitancy, Georg insists that he does, in fact, have a friend in St. Petersburg. At this point, the father, who only moments earlier had appeared to Georg to be, quote, still a giant, suddenly and inexplicably becomes very frail, requiring Georg to lift him, undress him, and put him to bed. At this point, the father, still appearing very weak, asks Georg whether he, the father, has been gut zugedeckt, well covered up. After Georg reassures his father twice that he has indeed covered up his father well, the old man violently casts the blanket to the side, jumps to his feet, and, while standing on the bed, accuses his son of having neglected the friend, the family, and the business. At the conclusion of this tirade, the father sentences Georg to, quote, death by drowning, a judgment the son appears to carry out, and without a word of protest. While allusions to reproduction abound throughout the story, I will limit the scope of my discussion to the father-son confrontation and its aftermath, for it is here that the birth metaphors are most elaborately developed. The sequence commences as Georg arrives to give his father the news that he is about to send the friend the letter. At the moment Georg enters the room, his father is essentially in utero, a state suggested first and foremost by the darkness of the room, a condition that is underscored to the point of redundancy. Quote, Georg was amazed how dark the father's room was, even on this sunny morning. Quote, it's unbearably dark in here, he then said. Yes, it's quite dark, answered the father. And shortly thereafter, Georg scolds his father with the words, you're sitting here in the dark. Similarly, the initial verbal exchange between father and son reveals the room to be almost hermetically sealed. You've closed the window as well? I prefer it that way. A bit later, the text reiterates the closed condition of the room as Georg chastens his father with the words, you're sitting here with the windows closed. The father then occupies a space that is dark, fully enclosed, and one can only assume quite hot since the conditions outside are described as sunny and quite warm. On the table lie, quote, the remains of breakfast, as if the father, in imitation of the fetus, derives sustenance from what has already been consumed, an impression that is reinforced when Georg observes, looking at his father, you're nipping at breakfast. The verb nippen in German can mean to nip, but it also means to sip, an anatomically closer description of the manner in which the embryo derives its nutrition via the umbilical cord. Finally, even the father's posture reinforces the impression of an embryo suspended inside the uterus. While gazing at his father, Georg thinks to himself, how broadly he sits there with his arms across his chest, a pose that recalls the fetal position. Taken together, the heat, closeness, and darkness of the room, as well as the father's embryonic form, suggest that the father does not inhabit a room, but rather a womb. Georg, for his part, finds himself suddenly thrust into a physical space that is pure potentiality, in a direct reflection of the stage he occupies in the life cycle, namely that of possible husband and father. The immediacy of fatherhood comes as something of a shock to Georg, who now sets about showing that he is fit to assume the role. To this end, the son hurriedly prepares for the father's impending birth. He declares, we have to establish another way of life for you, and from the ground up. Both, quote, another way of life and from the ground up suggest a life beginning anew. In addition, the son, without mentioning it explicitly, also clearly signals that he will, from this point forward, assume responsibility for the father's welfare. In doing so, he does not solicit the father's views, but instead simply announces the changes that are to be made, just as a parent would. First, the father will no longer be enclosed in the warm, dark room, but will be introduced to life outside the womb. Quote, you're sitting here with all the windows shut, and the air would do you such good. In preparation for the imminent birth, Georg announces that he will do what any expectant father would do under the circumstances, call for the doctor. I'll fetch the doctor, he declares, and we'll follow his directions. Of course, room will need to be made inside the house for the new arrival, a place where the infant can readily be observed. Quote, in the living room you would have good light, he tells the father. Georg is also cognizant of the baby's need for restful sleep. Quote, now lie in bed for a while, you absolutely need peace and quiet. Finally, the father's metaphorical birth is anticipated by Georg's announcement that he will change the father's clothes for him. By this clever device, the text alludes on the one hand to the naked state in which the individual is born. On the other, it introduces the changing of the infant's clothes as a symbolic test for fatherhood. Georg himself is well aware of the significance of the act as he tells his father, come, I'll help you take off your clothes. You'll see, I can do it. I submit that the statement, you'll see, I can do it, strongly suggests that Georg regards the act of undressing his father as a kind of test. If he did not, his assurance, uttered as much to himself as to his father, would make little sense. Now it gets good. At this point, the father advances from the state of fetus to that of infant, a transformation accompanied by striking changes in his appearance. Suddenly, the father, whom Georg had only moments earlier perceived as being, quote, still a giant, takes on virtually all the major physical attributes of a newborn. The father's mouth, for example, is, quote, toothless. His hair, like that of a baby, is, quote, fuzzy. The German word is funny, struppig, is fuzzy. His pupils are described as oversized, like that of a newborn whose eyes immediately following birth must adjust to the darkness of the must adjust from the darkness of the womb to the light outside. Like a newborn as well, the father momentarily appears unable to lift his head. Quote, the father had let his head sink to his chest. Georg kneels beside him as a new father might kneel alongside a cradle. Quote, Georg knelt down immediately alongside his father. Intent on demonstrating his fitness for fatherhood, Georg immediately goes about undressing his father as he had promised to. Despite his best efforts, however, Georg's desperate attempt to prove his suitability for fatherhood fails miserably. The first indication that Georg has failed the test is delivered as typically Kafkaesque tragicomedy. As Georg seeks to fulfill the duties of a parent caring for a baby, he undresses his father only to find that he has neglected to change his father's undergarments, an article of clothing which most closely resembles a baby's diapers. Quote, at the sight of the not particularly clean undergarments, he reproached himself for having neglected the father. It would have been his duty to attend to his father's dirty laundry. Georg's first indication that he is a failure as a father, then, comes not in the form of a verbal accusation he hears, but instead in the form of something concrete he can see, touch, and one can only assume smell. Still playing the role of infant, the father cannot walk, leaving it to Georg to carry him to bed. While holding his father in his arms, however, Georg is horrified to find his father toying with his watch chain, much as an infant might do. A terrible feeling came over him as he noticed, during the few steps to the bed, that his father was playing with his watch chain. This gesture anticipates the accelerated passage of time that will soon occur. Georg's, quote, terrible feeling, which is never explained in the text, derives from the knowledge that he has failed the test, that his time, so to speak, is up. Nevertheless determined, and with a palpable sense of urgency, Georg attempts to put the father to bed, in both the literal and figurative sense of the phrase. But it is too late. Georg's one opportunity to demonstrate that he is fit to play his part in, quote, the natural cycle is spent. In a moment, the father will dispense with the masquerade altogether to reassert his tremendous reproductive capacity, along with the absolute authority that attends it. Accordingly, the room will cease to function as a womb and will instead return to its original status as the sole dominion of the father. To appreciate the significance of this transformation, however, okay, blah, 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 blah. So basically, Kafka's room was right next to his parents' room. And I talk about this quote where Kafka would see his parents' night clothes laid out over the bed, and he'd get sick to his stomach, right? He was sick to his stomach basically at the idea of his parents having sex, right? Knowing fully well that Georg wants to be rid of him, the father pulls the blanket extra high over the shoulders so that presumably his head is only visible, which at once recalls the conflicting images of an elderly man on his deathbed and a newborn swaddled in a blanket. The question which the father puts to Georg twice in close succession, "Am I well covered up?" draws attention to the tremendous significance contained in the image of the father lying on the bed. Georg, for his part, would like the father to be the elderly man on the deathbed whose strength is declining. The father, however, is the newborn child whose strength is ascendant. These contradictory images, in turn, cast light on the metaphoric significance contained in the image of the father playing with the watch chain, for the struggle taking place between father and son is a struggle for the course which the future will take. The father has married, had children, works in industry, and is in every way the embodiment of the middle-class ideal. The son, by contrast, is a childlike bachelor who has shown no evidence of his own procreative power other than his habit of locking himself up in his office, ostensibly writing letters to a nameless friend living in a far-off land. The picture of the father lying in bed, a blanket pulled up past his shoulders with Georg standing at his side, marks the point at which the entire story pivots. Either Georg will succeed in laying his father to rest, in which case he will be standing beside a deathbed, or the father will reemerge as someone else, in which case he is standing beside a cradle. Either way, the result will determine Georg's fate. Will the father allow Georg to, figuratively speaking, lay him to rest so that Georg may take his place? The response is delivered with such sudden force that its effect is frightening, right? So the father's all, covered up, like, up to his neck, right? Yeah, and so the Georg says, "Are you well covered up?" And the father says, "Yes." And he says, "Are you well covered up?" Right? And then the father stands up, right? And he goes, "9!" Right? "No!" shouted his father, sending the answer resounding against the question. Flung back the blanket with such force that for an instant it unfurled completely in the air and stood upright on the bed. Okay? I mean, in German, it's just so powerful, right? If I can just read that just first line, right? "Nein!" Ja? Rief der Vater, dass die Antwort auf die Frage stieß. Like, it's really like the answer just bam into the question, right? Under the covers, a metamorphosis has taken place, as symbolized by the blanket, which the father casts off like a second skin. The second skin, quote, unfurled completely in mid-flight, demonstrating not only the raw strength with which the father hurls it, but by unfolding completely in mid-air, the second skin connotes youth. The German verb entfalten literally means to unfold, but it also contains within it the plural noun falten, which means wrinkles in German, an allusion to the wrinkles that characterize the skin of an elderly man or an infant. In this way, the blanket that becomes completely entfaltet, unfolded, or unwrinkled in flight suggests the old man is rejuvenated or that the baby has matured into manhood. Ultimately, the effect is the same. The wrinkles, i.e. signs of old age, infancy, disappear temporarily, and Georg, to his horror, is confronted with a man who, before his very eyes and in the space of minutes, has gone from resembling a fetus in utero to a newborn to, if measured by his strength, a virile young man of roughly Georg's age. This figure, now towering above Georg, literally and figuratively stands in judgment of him. Okay. I'm almost done. Everybody okay? Okay. All right, good. All right. The father, I didn't throw that in. Okay. The father will, as I noted previously, condemn his son to be born again out of this room. There's one element missing, however, and that is a mother figure, for the simple reason that a man cannot give birth to a child. In order to circumvent this potential limitation, the text temporarily ascribes maternal characteristics to the father. In this way, the direct link between Georg the writer and the father to whom he owes his existence is maintained metaphorically. The pattern commences as Georg gazes mutely at his father, who mocks his son's fiancée in the most vulgar possible manner, hawking up his nightshirt so high that his penis presumably would be visible. However, rather than seeing his father's genitalia as one might expect, Georg is confronted with a sight that calls to mind a mother's reproductive organs. Quote, all because she lifted her skirts. The father began to flute, and the verb flute is used. Because she lifted her skirts like so, the disgusting goose. And to demonstrate it, he hitched up his skirts so far that the war scar could be seen on his upper leg. Georg looks up to find a man, no doubt, but one temporarily in possession of a woman's physical attributes, the narbe or scar, a closed wound on his upper thigh, symbolizing the opening of the birth canal. Similarly, the father's booming voice has temporarily assumed a feminine tone. He does not shout, but instead flutes his words, which is to say he speaks in a high voice in a manner more akin to that of a woman. The fleeting impression of a mother figure is further reinforced by several of the father's statements, such as the bizarre declaration that Georg had once exited his body. Quote, do you suppose I didn't love you, I, out of whom you went forth? To wit, while it is common to the point of triteness for a mother to remind her children that she carried and delivered them into the world, it is highly unusual, to say of nothing of biologically dubious, for a father to make the same claim, or to even perceive of his own children that way. In much the same vein, the father's reference to Georg as mein Früchtchen, my little fruit, is a term one associates more readily with a female than a male speaker. Taken together, these maternal traits prefigure a birth that only superficially resembles a suicide. After all, a suicide, if nothing else, is an act of free will. It is arguably the supreme act of free will. Georg does not exercise free will at all, as a closer inspection of the text will reveal. Instead, he is forced out of the room by an external entity that lies beyond his control, much like a baby being pulled from the womb. Okay, so this is not the the paper goes on, but I'm not going to torture you any longer. But it gives you an idea of the kind of writing I do, the style of my writing, and also the way I try to demonstrate my thesis, right? That this room represents a womb. It's not a room at all. Okay. And yeah, so that's all of this paper that I'm going to read to you, and I want to thank you for listening, and I'd also like to open up the floor for questions. Don't all ask at once. Okay, we need order in here.
I do have a microphone that I can pass.
Yeah.
So it seems like you've done a lot of research, on
A fair
Kafka's
amount.
work. Yeah, a good amount, decent amount.
Yeah.
And I want to ask, like, how did you feel when you were reading this? Did you read it in the mother language, in the language that was written?
I read it in German the first time as an undergraduate.
Okay. And you've read it in English too, I'm assuming?
Yes, because
Yes, okay.
people have asked me for a good translation, and so I had to look around for a good translation, and there is a very good translation actually on the web. Yeah.
Okay. And I just wanted to ask for your opinion on the differences in just how grotesque the definitions get with like the imagery in German as opposed to English translations.
Oh gosh, that is an excellent question. As usual, something is always lost in the translation, and so I try and show that to an English-speaking audience, things that would be clearer to a German-speaking audience. For example, when the father throws that blanket, which I call a second skin, right? Momentarily in the air, it loses all of its what? All of its wrinkles, right? Exactly, right? And that's an allusion to the father's wrinkles, right? And so all of a sudden, instead of wrinkly skin, all of a sudden the skin is not wrinkled, right? And so I wouldn't say grotesqueness. I wouldn't judge it on that level, but I would say that the German words more often than not explain themselves and often have these double meanings, and that's part of the fun. It's kind of sussing them out, but you've also got to make a case for it. You can't just like dream it up. You've got to really support your reading with some evidence.
So what happened to Kafka later in his life?
That's an excellent question too. I told you that Kafka was into these health fads, right? Oh God, this relates right to 2026. So he's into these health fads, and one of the health fads he kept up for a while was drinking milk right from the source. What did that Pasteur guy know? Okay, Pasteur, whatever. And that guy know, right? So he'd drink raw cow's milk, and probably the strongest theory, because he died of tuberculosis, one of the strongest theories is that he got it from, ironically, following one of these health fads. And I have to think of today, RFK Jr., right, who is the head of Health and Human Services, and same kind of thing, right? We've got this one movement towards modernity and towards science, but you always have an opposite movement away from it. And I think that he represents that. I think that would be the scientific consensus. Why do I bring that up? I'm not bringing that up to get political. I'm bringing it up to say that debates that existed in the public sphere at Kafka's time are still with us, right? The role of women, if you go on 4chan and stuff like that, women should do what? What are trad wives? These are these terms that come up in right-wing discourse, right? And in the year 2026, you've got lots of men on the public airwaves saying that women shouldn't even be allowed to vote, that women should just have kids and stay at home, et cetera, et cetera. So, are we really that far away from? They were having the same exact discussion 126 years ago. Okay.
Great. I'm
Yes.
going to suggest that if people have, there's one more
Oh,
question
yes.
right there.
So he died of tuberculosis at age 40. Yes.
You mentioned that his sisters all died in concentration
Yes.
camps. You mentioned that his sisters all died in concentration camps. What was Kafka's war experience?
He had no war experience other than World War I. He was such a good lawyer, actually, that his boss would not let him sign up. And the accident insurance agency petitioned to have an exception made for him. And the petition was accepted by the government. But you can also imagine, here we go again, Kafka's intense feelings of what? Guilt, right? Because all the other men his age were where? They were at the front. Okay, and he gets to stay back. And there are parts in his dictionary where he was like, or dictionary, his diary, in his diary where he said, I've got to join the army, because the pressure was intense. A lot of you English professors know that in England, if you were a man, whether you were drafted or not, during World War I, and you didn't go, women would just randomly come up and give you a white feather, right? Meaning what? You were a coward, right? So there was no less, the coercion on the German side was no less intense, I assure you. So, but he died in 1924. Kafka was born in 1883, and he died in 1924. And when he died, he couldn't speak. He couldn't swallow. He basically died of starvation. And one of the last things he wrote was something legal, and it was to his best friend. And he said, okay, except for these 8 stories, I want you to take everything I've written and burn it. And, and that was his last will and testament. And people think that Kafka knew darn well that there's no way his best friend, who was the very one who pushed him to write and get it published, could possibly burn his stuff. So his best friend was named Max Brod, and Max Brod spent the rest of his life being the literary executor of Kafka. And he took it very seriously. And so without Max Brod, we wouldn't know who Kafka was, pretty much. And he had some big time admirers during his life. One of them was the most famous German poet of the 20th century, Rainer Maria Rilke. Was a big fan. Kurt Tucholsky was a big fan, but Kafka himself during his life got very little recognition for his writing. So it's really because of his best friend, Max Brod, that we know about him. And Max Brod barely escaped the Holocaust himself. Max Brod was Jewish. All of Kafka's friends were Jewish. That was, you stayed with your tribe back then.
Great. I'm going to suggest if there are additional questions, I know Chuck would be happy to take you up here and you can ask those questions. I want to alert students that are here, there's a sheet of paper on that back table. The university is running a UTM Plus program. If you put your name and your 960 number, those will be passed on and you'll be entered into drawings for giveaways that the Student Affairs Department has done. So I'm hoping maybe you could put your hands together and thank our speaker for his time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.